The cameras cut sharply into the hearing room, fluorescent lights bouncing off polished wood, the hum of tension thick enough to choke. Jim Jordan leans forward, his sleeves rolled up like a boxer about to throw punches, voice rising in the chamber. He interrupts before the question is even finished, spitting words over the microphone, as if volume alone could make him right. Every syllable drips with arrogance. A man so convinced of his own invincibility that he doesn't notice the silence settling around him. Across the table sits Jasmine Crockett, unmoved. Her eyes lock onto him with the calm precision of a surgeon. Preparing for the first cut, while Jordan blusters, Crockett doesn't flinch. She doesn't roll her eyes. She doesn't meet chaos with chaos. She waits. And in that pause, pregnant, deliberate, the entire room seems to bend toward her. What happened next left even his allies stunned. Jordan shuffles his stack of papers, waving them like shields, throwing accusations he can't quite land. He jabs his finger in the air, a performance perfected over years of shouting others down. Yet the harder he pushes, the more glaring the contrast becomes. On one side, noise, fury, a man desperate to dominate. On the other, poise, silence, an unbreakable presence waiting to strike at the exact right moment. Reporters shift in their seats, sensing the tension thickening into something. Historic phones are raised, recording. Twitter threads are already forming in real time. Even members behind Jordan glance uneasily at one another, unsure of where this exchange is headed. Crockett finally leans forward, slow and measured, as if time itself has slowed to give her this stage. The room stills. Jordan keeps talking, but suddenly his voice sounds hollow, echoing against walls that no longer seem to support him, because everyone knows. The shift is coming. Everyone feels the ground tilting. Jordan believes he controls the moment. He believes this will end, like all the others, with noise drowning out reason. But Crockett is not here to play by his rules. She is here to rewrite them. And when she finally opens her mouth, every head turns, every screen lights up, and history tilts in her direction. What she says next will change everything. Congressional hearings are supposed to be more than theater. They are meant to be the safeguard, the watchdog, the line of defense for a democracy that depends on accountability. In that chamber, every question, every answer is supposed to carry the weight of truth. But too often, the stage is hijacked by those who mistake volume for substance, who twist oversight into spectacle. This day was no exception. Jim Jordan wasn't just interrupting. He was playing a familiar role, the agitator who floods the zone with noise, who hopes that chaos itself can bury inconvenient truths. He demanded answers but dodged them himself. He shouted about law while sidestepping accountability. His strategy was clear: if he could distract, if he could distort, then he could win the narrative before the truth ever had a chance to breathe. But Jasmine Crockett sat across from him as the antithesis of that performance. In a room where bluster had become currency, she refused to spend a single cent of it. Her power came not from the noise she made, but from the silence she held. Silence that unnerved her opponent more than any insult could. She wasn't there to trade blows. She was there to remind America why oversight mattered, why hearings mattered, why truth mattered, because the stakes stretched far beyond that committee room. For every immigrant family watching, for every working-class parent tuning in, for every young person learning whether their leaders could be trusted. This was more than a spat between politicians. This was about whether justice could withstand the corrosion of arrogance, whether dignity could stand tall against the cheap tactics of distraction. Jordan represented the old playbook: muddy the waters until no one can tell truth from lies. Crockett represented something far rarer in that moment: clarity. Her calm presence was not passive, it was a weapon. She wasn't simply defending herself from his outbursts. She was defending the very notion that facts, law, and accountability should matter more than theater. The room could feel it. The audience watching at home could feel it too. This wasn't just another shouting match destined to dissolve into sound bites. This was a collision between two visions of America, one that thrives on chaos, and one that insists on order rooted in truth. Jordan's allies leaned back, some smirking, others impatient, convinced they had seen this movie before. But Crockett wasn't playing a supporting role. She was seizing the frame, commanding the script, reshaping the entire arc of the hearing with the weight of her composure. And that is why this mattered. Because in the noise of Washington, silence is easy to overlook, till someone wields it like a blade. Crockett's silence wasn't emptiness. It was focus. It was intent. And it was the prelude to something none of them had prepared for. But the way she chose to respond would echo far beyond this room. To understand why the confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Jim Jordan carried such weight, you have to step back and examine the man across from Hertha, an antagonist who had fashioned an entire career out of chaos. Jim Jordan wasn't just another congressman raising his voice in a committee room. He was the embodiment of a strategy that had reshaped American politics. Fight every battle like a war, shout down dissent, and treat oversight not as a duty, but as an obstacle. Jordan built his brand on stonewalling. When questions turned uncomfortable, he deflected. When accountability loomed, he disappeared into shadows of denial. The scandals that followed him, from his controversial role in wrestling locker room allegations during his Ohio State days, to his repeated refusals to comply with subpoenas during critical investigations, only sharpened his reputation as a man who demanded transparency from others while dodging it for himself. For Jordan, rules were weapons, not principles. They were things to be invoked against opponents, then conveniently ignored when turned back toward him. And still, he thrived. His loud, aggressive style made him a darling of the culture wars. To his base, he wasn't a legislator, but a fighter. Someone who turned every hearing into a stage and every microphone into a megaphone. He branded himself as the voice of law and order, yet time and again his actions revealed a deep contradiction. He shouted about discipline while undermining institutions meant to enforce it. He demanded answers from others while refusing to answer the simplest of questions himself. That contradiction was his Achilles heel. Because what Jordan failed to grasp was that law and order, when stripped of consistency, collapses into hypocrisy. And hypocrisy, when exposed under bright lights, is devastating. His arrogance made him blind to the danger. Each time he raised his voice, he assumed it carried the power to overwhelm. He mistook fear for respect, mistook volume for victory. And in that chamber, on that day, he believed he could once again bend the narrative by sheer force of will. But arrogance has a way of setting traps for the arrogant. Jordan had grown too comfortable in his performance, too reliant on noise to cover his vulnerabilities. He didn't notice how every outburst only sharpened the contrast between himself and Crockett. Where he flailed, she sat composed. Where he shouted, she measured. Each second of his bluster only prepared the ground for the quiet precision of her strike, and his record left him exposed. For years, critics had pointed out the gap between the values he claimed to champion and the actions he took. How could a man who defied a subpoena lecture others about the rule of law? How could a politician who looked away from allegations of abuse claim the mantle of protector? These weren't minor inconsistencies, they were glaring cracks in the armor he had so carefully polished, but Jordan didn't see the cracks. He never did. His confidence swelled from repetition, from the idea that if you shout long enough, the truth will bend to the sound. It worked for him before. Why wouldn't it work again? That was his mistake. Because across from him sat someone who didn't flinch at his fury, someone who had spent her career defending those who couldn't afford to be heard. Jasmine Crockett didn't need to shout to expose him. She didn't need to meet arrogance with arrogance. She needed only to ask the kind of questions that stripped away the mask, leaving nothing but the contradictions beneath. Jordan entered that hearing certain of his control, certain that he had set the stage as he always had, him as the aggressor, his opponent forced into retreat. But what he didn't realize, what he couldn't realize, was that the ground had already shifted. The very tactics he relied on had been inverted against him. Every outburst was rope on which he would hang. Himself, he thought this was his performance. He thought this was his script, but he had no idea the trap was already set. To grasp the force of Jasmine Crockett's presence in that committee room, You must travel back to the roots of her story, a story carved not from privilege, but from struggle, persistence, and a stubborn refusal to be silenced. Crockett was never supposed to be the kind of figure who stood toe-to-toe with political juggernauts. She came from the margins, shaped by a community that understood firsthand what it meant to be overlooked, discounted, and dismissed. And it was from that soil of hardship that her strength grew. Before the cameras, before the congressional hearings, Crockett's battleground was the courtroom. She was a public defender, a role that rarely receives applause but carries the weight of justice on its back. Day after day, she defended the voiceless, the single mother whose paycheck couldn't cover bail, the young man swept up in an unforgiving system, the immigrant family staring down deportation with no resources to fight. She carried their stories into sterile courtrooms, armed not with power or privilege, but with the unshakable belief that dignity belonged to everyone, even though society tried hardest to erase. It was brutal work. The hours were long. The pay was meager, and the victories were often small and hard-won. But each case, each client, etched deeper into her the understanding that justice was not an abstract concept. It was personal. It was the difference between a family staying together or being torn apart, between someone building a future or being locked away. She learned that the law was not naturally fair. It had to be bent toward fairness by those with the courage to stand in the gap. Crockett's roots in an immigrant-connected community only deepened her resolve. She knew the stories of sacrifice, the parents who worked 2 jobs so their children could have a chance, and the elders who endured discrimination, but still told their children to believe in the promise of America. Her life was proof that the American dream was fragile, always under threat, and only real when people fought to keep it alive. That fight became her North Star. When she stepped into politics, it wasn't out of ambition for power, but out of necessity. She had seen too many lives crushed by systems designed to favor the loudest and wealthiest. She had seen how the voiceless were drowned out by those who could purchase microphones. Running for office was never about climbing a ladder. It was about carrying those silenced voices into rooms where decisions were made. Her rise was anything but guaranteed. She was underestimated at every step. Political insiders dismissed her as too raw, too young, too unpolished. Opponents sneered at her background as a defender of criminals, not realizing that those very experiences gave her an unshakable connection to the communities she served. She was an underdog in every sense of the word, yet each challenge only sharpened her resolve, and resolve became her weapon. Crockett had the kind of grit forged in courtrooms, where everything was stacked against her, and in communities where survival depended on resilience. That same grit carried her into the halls of Congress, where she refused to become another politician lost in the machinery. Instead, she wore her underdog story like armor. She never forgot where she came from, never forgot the families who had trusted her with their hopes, never forgot that her very presence in those rooms was proof that the margins could push back. Her sacrifices were real. She gave up comfort, endured relentless attacks, and withstood the exhaustion of constantly being underestimated. But she carried those burdens willingly, knowing they were tethered to something bigger. The possibility of a politics that actually spoke for the people, too, was often erased from history. So when she sat across from Jim Jordan in that committee room, she wasn't just another member of Congress waiting her turn to speak. She was the culmination of years of standing against noise, against intimidation, against systems designed to break people like her before they ever had a chance to fight back. Her calm wasn't accidental. It was practiced, earned through trial. After trial, where composure meant survival, that's why she didn't flinch when Jordan raised his voice. That's why she didn't crumble under his bluster. She had seen louder storms, harsher judgments, crueler systems. Compared to that, his theatrics were nothing more than wind, and it's why the moment mattered so deeply. This wasn't just about her versus him. It wasn't about one argument or one exchange. It was about everything she carried into that room. Weight of the silenced, the dignity of the overlooked, the sacrifices of families who had always been told they didn't belong. She carried them all in her composure, in her silence, in the quiet certainty that truth could stand tall even when surrounded by chaos. This was more than a debate. It was her entire life's work condensed into one moment. The air in the hearing room thickened with each passing second. Jim Jordan, leaning forward like a man desperate to seize control, cut into Crockett's opening words before she could complete a single sentence. His voice, already booming, rose louder with each interruption. He repeated himself again and again, circling the same accusations. As though sheer repetition could disguise the hollowness of his claims, his face reddened. With the strain, veins pressing at his temples, the sharp edge of desperation creeping into his tone. He jabbed his finger across the table, his words spilling out like a flood that refused to be dammed. Yet the harder he pushed, the more the cracks in his performance revealed themselves. His aggression, once meant to intimidate, now carried the unmistakable scent of panic. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't even shift in her chair. Instead, she leaned back slightly, her expression steady, her eyes unblinking as Jordan ranted. Her calm presence only magnified his chaos. It was as if the louder he shouted, the more she absorbed it, turning his own fury into evidence of his weakness. The room began to sense the shift. Reporters scribbled furiously, not because Jordan was breaking new ground, but because Crockett's composure was beginning to tell a story of its own. Members seated nearby exchanged glances, some stifling smirks at how visibly rattled Jordan was becoming. Even through the cold distance of television screens, viewers at home could see the imbalance. One man unraveling. One woman commanding without ever raising her tone. Jordan cut her off again, repeating a line that had already lost its power. "Answer the question," he barked, though he had never let her finish one. His voice cracked with the strain, betraying the fury bubbling beneath his practiced bravado. Crockett tilted her head slightly, as if considering him not as an opponent, but as a case study, and then she spoke, not rushed, not defensive, but precise, each word deliberate. Her voice was steady, almost surgical, slicing through his noise without ever matching it. "Congressman," she said, her tone laced with patience that felt like quiet steel, "if you'll allow me to finish. Perhaps we can finally get to the facts." The effect was instantaneous. The room hushed, not because Jordan had fallen silent, but because everyone could feel the ground tilting beneath him. Aggression was no longer commanding the moment. It was eroding it. Jordan tried again, his voice straining to reclaim dominance. But each attempt to interrupt only highlighted the contrast. He was grasping, repeating himself in circles. While she stood rooted in composure, her words cutting with precision that his volume couldn't match, the audience inside the chamber and across the country recognized the transformation unfolding. The balance of power was shifting before their eyes. The villain, once so certain of his control, was unraveling in real time. The hero, underestimated and dismissed, was proving untouchable in her composure. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply waited for the right opening, letting Jordan's rage burn itself out like a fire consuming its own fuel. And when she finally leaned forward, her voice steady, her gaze unyielding, everyone knew the moment of impact had arrived, and then she dropped the first question that would unravel him completely. The room stilled as Jasmine Crockett leaned into her microphone. The chaos Jordan had unleashed just seconds earlier still lingered in the air like smoke. But she cut through it with a calm so sharp it silenced even the restless shuffling of papers. Her voice wasn't raised, it wasn't hurried, it wasn't desperate. It was steady, deliberate, the tone of someone who knew she was about to peel back the layers of performance and reveal the hollowness at its core. "Congressman," she began, each syllable measured, "do you recall the oath we all took when we assumed office?" The question was simple, disarmingly simple. Jordan blinked, caught off guard, his jaw tightening, as if he'd expected a fiery rebuttal, not a quiet reminder. "Of duty, of course," he snapped, trying to recover with confidence. "We swore to uphold the Constitution." "Exactly," Crockett replied, her eyes narrowing just slightly, her tone unchanging. "And the Constitution requires that we operate within the bounds of law, does it not?" Jordan shifted in his chair. Obviously, he muttered louder than necessary, as though the volume could hide the unease flickering across his face. Crockett paused. That pause was everything. Stretched across the room, pulling the audience in, forcing everyone to hang on her next words. Even the cameras seemed to lean closer, capturing the exact second when arrogance began to buckle under precision. "Then explain to this committee," she said softly, "how refusing a lawful subpoena demonstrates respect for the very law you claim to defend." The silence that followed was deafening. Jordan opened his mouth, but no words came. He blinked rapidly, his bravado collapsing into hesitation. For the first time all day, he looked less like the commander of the room and more like a man caught in a trap he hadn't seen coming. Reporters' pens froze. Staffers exchanged wide-eyed glances. The air seemed to vibrate with anticipation, collective recognition that a shift of historic proportions was underway. Jordan cleared his throat, stammering, That's not the point." But Crockett didn't let him. "Off the hook." She leaned forward, her tone calm, surgical, cutting through his deflections. "It is the point, Congressman. You demanded accountability here today. And yet, when accountability knocked on your door, you refused to answer. How do you reconcile that contradiction?" Her words hung in the chamber like a gavel strike. Jordan fumbled with his notes, his eyes darting down as if searching for a line that might rescue him. "There was none. You see," she continued, her voice gaining the rhythm of inevitability. "The law isn't selective. It doesn't bend for power. It doesn't pause for privilege. If you claim to uphold it, you must also submit to it. Otherwise, you are not defending the Constitution, you are dismantling it." Jordan's face flushed crimson. He raised his voice, tried to interrupt, but the effect was hollow. His protest landed like weak echoes against the unshakable wall. Of her composure, Crockett didn't press harder. She didn't need to. She simply allowed the silence after each question to do the work. Every pause was a mirror reflecting Jordan's inability to answer. Every measured look was a spotlight, exposing the weakness behind the bluster. Then came the next strike. "Congressman," she asked, "can you cite a single statute, just one, that permits a witness to ignore a lawful subpoena because it is politically inconvenient?" Again, silence. Jordan's mouth opened, then closed. He shifted, tugged at his collar, his hand drumming nervously on the desk. "No," Crockett said softly, almost as if she were answering for him, "because there isn't one." The room exhaled collectively. Porters scribbled furiously again. Viewers at home leaned forward on couches, phones buzzing with the first waves of reaction. A shift this profound could not be contained. Jordan, visibly rattled now, attempted to fight back with indignation. "This is grandstanding. This is political theater," barked, his voice cracking under the strain. Crockett didn't flinch. She tilted her head, a small, knowing smile, tugging at the corner of her lips. A smirk, not of arrogance, but of certainty. "No, Congressman," she replied, her tone like tempered steel. "This is accountability, and perhaps that is why it feels so unfamiliar to you." The line landed with seismic force. Laughter rippled through the audience, quickly stifled but impossible to ignore. Even members seated behind Jordan lowered their eyes, their confidence in his performance collapsing by the second. Crockett pressed no further. She didn't need to. The damage was done. She had asked the simplest of questions, questions rooted not in theatrics, but in law. Questions any genuine defender of the Constitution should have been able to answer without hesitation. And Jordan had failed, publicly, spectacularly. His confidence crumbled in real time. Where moments ago he had been the aggressor, now he sat cornered, his volume betraying desperation, his defenses unraveling with each passing second. Crockett, by contrast, remained unshaken. She didn't raise her voice, didn't lose her composure. She allowed the truth, sharp and undeniable, to speak louder than any shout ever could. The hearing room buzzed with the electricity of a turning point. Reporters already imagined the headlines. Twitter already envisioned the clips that would go viral before nightfall. This was not just a skirmish, it was a takedown, surgical and complete. Jordan leaned back, his face tight with frustration, searching for footing he would never regain. Crockett's gaze remained fixed, unwavering. the embodiment of dignity holding its ground against chaos, and then, with the weight of inevitability pressing down, she delivered the closing strike. "Congressman," she said, her voice quiet, but unyielding when you cannot answer the simplest legal questions, "perhaps it is not the law that has failed but you." The silence that followed was absolute. No interruptions, no muttered retorts, no nervous laughter. Just silence heavy, damning final. And in that silence, the truth roared louder than any of Jordan's outbursts. One question. And the room exploded. The moment Jasmine Crockett dismantled Jim Jordan with surgical precision. It was clear something extraordinary had just unfolded. But what no one in that committee room could fully predict was how quickly the shockwaves would ripple beyond those four walls. Within minutes, clips of the exchange were sliced, posted, and shared across every corner of social media. By the time Crockett had even left the chamber, her words had already traveled farther than the marble halls of Congress ever could. Twitter lit up first. Hashtags erupted in real time. Hashtag Crockett crushes Jordan. Hashtag law and order backfire. Hashtag subpoena silence. Within hours, the clips had racked up millions of views. One video showing Jordan's stunned silence after her legal question became the centerpiece of countless reaction threads. Viewers looped the moment over and over again, the pause, the stammer. The smirk on Crockett's face, as though savoring a cinematic climax. TikTok followed suit. Creators layered the exchange with dramatic music, slow-motion cuts, and on-screen. Captions like "This is how you check hypocrisy." Memes flooded Instagram. Jordan's blank stare photoshopped into movie posters. Crockett portrayed as a superhero calmly dismantling villains with nothing but truth. Even children and teenagers, far from the intricacies of congressional hearings, were resharing her takedown as a lesson in standing your ground. Late-night television hosts seized on it with glee. Monologues replayed the clip to raucous laughter, each comedian adding their own punchline to Jordan's fumbling silence. One compared the moment to a student trying to bluff their way through an exam they never studied for. Another quipped, "For a guy who never stops talking, silence has never been louder." The audiences roared, clapping not just for the humor but for the rare sight of arrogance collapsing in real time. Then came the celebrities. Tweets from actors, musicians, and cultural icons poured in, praising Crockett's composure. A Grammy-winning artist wrote, "This woman just reminded us what true strength looks like: calm, smart, and unshakable." Jasmine Crockett, you're a queen. Best-selling author, posted the clip with the caption, "Every immigrant family in America knows this silence. It's the silence before you prove them wrong." Retweets numbered in the hundreds of thousands, but perhaps the most powerful reactions came from ordinary people, the nurses watching the clip after a long shift, the teachers replaying it during lunch, the immigrant families sharing it at dinner. Tables across the country, comments poured in. Finally, someone said what we've been screaming at the TV for years. She didn't just win an argument. She spoke for us. This is why representation matters. It was validation on a national scale. Crockett wasn't simply celebrated for landing a sharp political blow. She was embraced as a symbol of dignity, triumphing over arrogance, truth prevailing over noise. She embodied the underdog, rising above the bully, the voice of clarity refusing to be drowned out by chaos. America loves a hero, and in that moment, Jasmine Crockett became one. News outlets scrambled to cover the viral explosion. Headlines ranged from straightforward Crockett silences Jordan with simple legal question to the dramatic, the moment Congress tilted. Crockett's mic drop heard across America. Editorials praised her discipline, contrasting it with Jordan's unraveling performance. Analysts debated whether this was the moment that would define her career, the instant she crossed from freshman lawmaker to national figure. For Jordan, the fallout was brutal. The memes mocked him relentlessly, portraying him as a man outmatched by facts. His allies scrambled to spin the moment. Every attempt at damage control was drowned out by the tidal wave of viral reaction. No soundbite could undo the visual of his silence, his fumbling, his collapse. For Crockett, the validation was overwhelming. Overnight, her follower count surged by hundreds of thousands. Grassroots organizations reached out, eager to amplify her voice. Donations to her campaign spiked as supporters flooded her inbox with messages of gratitude. Visibility. She had earned credibility, respect, a kind of cultural resonance few politicians ever achieve, because this was bigger than politics. It was about every moment in American life when the powerful tried to silence the powerless, when noise tried to suffocate truth. And in Crockett's calm dismantling of Jordan, millions saw themselves, their struggles, their frustrations, their hopes reflected back with dignity. As the dust settled from the viral explosion, Jasmine Crockett chose not to revel in the spotlight or bask in her opponent's humiliation. Instead, she reframed the entire exchange, lifting it beyond the narrow confines of political theater. For her, this was never simply about defeating Jim Jordan in a war of words. It was about showing the country that truth does not have to shout, to be heard, and that dignity, when wielded with discipline, can stand taller than arrogance ever could. She reminded America that oversight hearings are not games. They are solemn instruments of accountability built into the foundation of democracy itself. When Jordan tried to turn them into a circus, she countered not with louder noise but with clarity. Her message was unshakable. The law applies to all, even those who wield power, and especially those who think they are untouchable. In that moment, she became the embodiment of what it means to serve, not posture. Her words rippled far beyond Washington. They spoke to immigrants who had endured the sting of being talked over, dismissed, or doubted. They spoke to working-class families who had long been ignored by those in power. They spoke to every person who had ever been silenced by arrogance, and wondered if justice would ever bend in their direction. The universal moral was plain: dignity wins, arrogance loses. Jordan's fury may have dominated the decibels, but Crockett's composure dominated history. She didn't need to shout to prove her strength. She didn't need to grandstand to reveal hypocrisy. She showed that calm, unshakable adherence too. Truth carries more force than any red-faced tirade, and that, perhaps, was the deeper lesson. America has always struggled with the tension between noise and principle. Too often, the loudest voices drown out the most important ones, but Crockett's moment reminded us that real power doesn't come from drowning others out. It comes from refusing to be drowned. She spoke of justice, not as an abstraction, but as a lived experience. Justice is the immigrant family holding on to hope. Justice is the public defender standing beside the accused. Justice is the belief that America's promise should belong to everyone, not just the privileged few who shout the loudest. In Crockett's victory, millions were reminded that the fight for dignity is not lost, that the arc of accountability can still bend toward truth, and perhaps most importantly, she reminded us of Americanas, not the hollow slogan used to exclude, but the living principle that inclusion, fairness, and equality are what give this nation its meaning. Her moment was a declaration that service is greater than spectacle, truth is greater than noise, and that courage is greater than arrogance. It wasn't just her win. It was a collective win for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, who had ever been silenced, who had ever been underestimated. Crockett's calm wasn't just her own. It was a mirror reflecting the resilience of millions who hold on to dignity even in the face of dismissal. And in that moment, millions felt seen. Jasmine Crockett destroys Jim Jordan on live TV. That was the headline. It's the moment that captured America's attention. But the real story wasn't just about a congressman silenced or a viral clip replayed millions of times. It was about what that silence represented. It was the sound of arrogance collapsing under the weight of truth, the sound of dignity breaking through the noise. And here's the truth. Moments like this don't happen in isolation. They happen because people like you demand better, share the truth, and amplify voices that deserve to be heard. Crockett's composure was more than personal strength. It was a reflection of a movement, a reminder that when we stand together, no amount of shouting can drown us out. If you believe in that movement, if you believe in clarity over chaos, in justice over spectacle, in leaders who serve rather than grandstand, then you are part of this story. and this is your chance to keep it alive. Subscribe, share this video, and spread the moment that made millions feel seen. Because the louder we echo dignity, the harder it becomes for arrogance to hide. This isn't just about one debate in one room. It's about reshaping the culture of power in America, one truth at a time. So stand with us. Stand with Jasmine Crockett. Stand for the values that make this country worth fighting for. The headlines will fade, but the impact doesn't have. 2. Together we can make sure the message rings louder than the noise. Truth wins. Dignity endures, and arrogance always falls. And it starts with you're right here, right now. Join us.